Nobody keeps a seized-up chainsaw. You curse at it, kick it into the darkest corner of the barn, and let the rust take it. So when a 16-year-old kid started knocking on doors, begging for our ruined steels and blown-out Husqvarnas, we didn't just say no. We laughed. Oakhaven was a town that chewed up machinery and spat out the husks. Decades of clear-cutting the rocky Appalachian foothills had left the soil thin and the men with bad backs. When the primary timber mill shut down in the late 90s, it took the town's pride with it. What remained was a quiet, grinding sort of poverty. People held on to things they didn't need, simply because they couldn't afford to throw them away. Barns became graveyards for dead tractors, stripped trucks, and broken tools. Enter Caleb. He was 16, mostly collarbone and elbows, swimming in a faded canvas work jacket that had belonged to his grandfather. Caleb didn't talk much. He just observed. He watched the way the frost killed the early tomatoes, and he watched the way his father, Arthur, stared at the kitchen wall when the mail arrived. Arthur had crushed his pelvis under a rolling skidder 14 months ago. The heavy timber he'd been trying to move to pay the winter heating bill had snapped the choker cable, rolling back and pinning him against a stump. He survived, but his leg was held together by a halo of surgical steel and titanium pins. The physical therapy was agonizing. The medical bills were worse. Caleb began his strange crusade on a damp Tuesday in November. He started at Old Man Higgins' place. Higgins was sitting on his porch, a heavy quilt over his knees, working a piece of pine with a pocket knife. Caleb pulled a rusted red wagon up the driveway, the wheels squeaking in a sad, rhythmic cadence. "Mr. Higgins," Caleb said, his voice cracking slightly before settling into a flat, businesslike tone. "You got any dead chainsaws?" Higgins stopped whittling. He looked at the boy, then at the empty wagon. "Dead chainsaws? You mean broken ones?" "Yes, sir. Blown engines, cracked blocks, stripped gears. I'll take whatever you got." Higgins let out a dry, rasping bark of a laugh. "Boy, I got a Husqvarna in the shed that's been locked up tighter than a bank vault since 2012. Ain't no fixing it. The piston melted right to the cylinder wall. Can I have it?" Higgins stared. The amusement faded into a kind of tired pity. "You can take it, Caleb, but you can't fix a dead dog by petting it. Put your time into something useful. Go bag groceries down at the Piggly Wiggly." "Thank you, sir," Caleb said. He hauled the heavy, grease-caked mass of orange plastic and steel out of Higgins's shed and dropped it into the wagon. He went to the Miller farm next, then to Hank's auto shop, then to the properties of men who had long since given up on logging, but still kept the carcasses of their tools. The town talked. In Oakhaven, gossip moved faster than the county snowplows. They said Arthur's boy was cracking under the pressure. They said he was building a scrap pile out of pure delusion. Men laughed over black coffee at the dine, shaking their heads at the sight of this scrawny teenager dragging a wagon full of oily garbage down the shoulder of County Road 9. "He asked for my old steel," Hank told the diner crowd one morning, wiping a grease-stained hand on a rag. Thing was missing a carburetor, half the casing was cracked, and the bar was bent like a horseshoe. I told him he was better off trying to milk a bull. Kid didn't even blink, just threw it in the wagon. Nobody understood the math Caleb was doing in his head. They didn't see the kitchen table at his house. They didn't see the foreclosure notice sitting under the salt shaker. The bank had given them 90 days. The property taxes were 2 years in arrears. The medical debt was a suffocating weight. What they had was land. 40 acres of untouched prime white oak and black walnut sitting on a ridge behind the house. It was beautiful timber, straight, tall, and dense, but selling it on the stump to a commercial logging outfit would pay pennies on the dollar. The big companies knew who was desperate. They'd offered Arthur $5,000 for the whole lot. It wasn't even a quarter of what they owed. To make real money, you needed to sell milled lumber. High-grade, rough-sawn hardwood boards. Furniture makers and custom builders paid a premium for it. But a commercial band saw mill cost $15,000. Arthur told Caleb to give it up. "We're going to have to sell the land, son," he said one evening, rubbing his ruined leg. The house was cold. They were keeping the thermostat at 55 degrees to save oil. "It's over. We tried. The big boys win. That's just the way the world spins." Caleb looked out the frosted window toward the barn. His wagon was out there, loaded with a dozen dead chainsaws. "We ain't dead yet, Dad," Caleb said softly. He grabbed his coat and walked out into the freezing night. The shed was a decaying, uninsulated outbuilding that smelled of mouse droppings, wet rot, and stale gasoline. The dirt floor was permanently stained black from years of leaking oil. Caleb dragged a heavy sheet of plywood across 2 wobbly sawhorses. This was his operating table. He rigged a bare 60-watt bulb to a rafter, dangling it down on an extension cord so it cast a harsh, yellow pool of light over his scavenged parts. He didn't have a service manual. He had a stubbornness born of pure, cold panic. He began the tear down. He stripped the heavy Husqvarna from Higgins first. Every bolt was rusted in place. He soaked them in penetrating oil, tapping the heads with a ball-peen hammer to break the corrosion. When a torque screw stripped out, he didn't throw a fit. He calmly chucked a left-handed drill bit into his grandfather's heavy steel drill, bit into the ruined screw, and backed it out by force. He gutted the machines. He separated the useless from the salvageable. A cracked block went into a scrap bucket. A perfectly good carburetor was carefully set aside on a clean rag. He pulled ignition coils, fuel lines, flywheels, and clutches. His hands became raw. The harsh chemical sting of carburetor cleaner settled deep into the cuts on his knuckles. Grease embedded itself so deeply under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could lift it. His plan was simple in theory, impossible in execution. He wanted to build an Alaskan chainsaw mill. Normally, this was just a metal bracket that clamped onto a large chainsaw bar, allowing a single operator to guide the saw horizontally down a log, slicing off planks. But white oak is brutal wood. It fights back. To rip-cut a 30-inch oak log, you need a massive, professional-grade saw with extreme torque. If you try it with a standard farm saw, you'll melt the engine in 10 minutes. Caleb had a pile of standard, broken farm saws. So he decided to build a monster. He couldn't afford a single massive engine. But he had parts. He spent 3 days piecing together 2 identical 70cc engines. He took the intact cylinder from one saw and married it to the uncracked block of another. He rebuilt the carburetors using a mishmash of salvaged gaskets, cutting his own replacements out of thick gasket paper with an X-Acto knife when necessary. By the second week, he had 2 working powerheads. But 2 separate engines holding 2 separate bars wouldn't work. They needed to drive one singular, massive cutting chain. He took his dirt bike, heavily loaded with an old, patched-up alternator he'd found in the ditch, down to Gus's scrapyard on the edge of town. Gus was a hard man who dealt in rust and cash. "I need steel," Caleb told him, dropping the alternator on Gus's grease-stained counter. "Heavy angle iron, bed frames, steel tubing, straight as you got." Gus looked at the alternator, spun the pulley with a thick thumb, and grunted. "I'll give you 50 pounds of scrap for it. You pull it yourself." Caleb spent 2 hours digging through jagged mountains of metal in the freezing sleet. He dragged out heavy-gauge steel, loading it onto a makeshift trailer behind his bike. Back in the shed, he borrowed his uncle's old Lincoln arc welder. It was an antique buzz box that drew so much power it dimmed the lights in the house every time he struck an arc. For 4 nights, the blue, violent flash of the welder lit up the cracks in the shed walls. The neighbors complained about the noise of his angle grinder screaming against steel at 2 in the morning. He was fabricating a custom carriage. He mounted both rebuilt engines side by side onto a rigid steel frame. He had taken 2 broken guide bars to a local machinist, trading a weekend of sweeping floors to have the man weld them end to end and temper them straight, creating one monstrous 40-inch bar. He geared the engines together. He rigged a dual throttle system using a salvaged brake cable from a 10-speed bicycle, ensuring that pulling one trigger would open the carburetors on both engines simultaneously. It was ugly. The welds looked like stacked dimes buried in slag. The metal was a patchwork of rusted iron, faded orange plastic, and shiny new bolts. It weighed nearly 90 pounds. It looked less like a tool and more like a weapon of war. Then came the night of the test. It was 11 p.m. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees. Caleb's breath plumed in the freezing air of the shed. He was exhausted. He had failed a math test that morning because he couldn't keep his eyes open. His fingers were stiff and bruised. He mixed a fresh can of high-octane gas with 2-stroke oil, pouring it carefully into the dual tanks. He primed the bulbs. He flipped the chokes. He set his boot on the base of the heavy steel frame. He grabbed the pull cord of the left engine. He yanked. Nothing. A dull, lifeless thud of compression. He yanked again. And again. His shoulder burned. He moved to the right engine. Pulled. Nothing. Despair hit him like a physical blow. He dropped the cord. He stared at the monstrous machine. Higgins was right. The whole town was right. You can't fix a dead dog. He had wasted a month. The bank was coming. They were going to lose the farm. He sank down onto a bucket, putting his greasy face in his hands. The silence in the shed was deafening. 10 minutes passed. The cold seeped into his bones. He looked up. He grabbed a screwdriver. He leaned over the machine and adjusted the idle screws on both carburetors, turning them a 1/4 inch richer. He stood up. He grabbed the left cord and pulled with everything he had left. Crack sputter die. It fired. He adjusted the choke, pulled again. The left engine roared to life, spitting a thick cloud of blue smoke into the freezing air. It idled high, a vicious, screaming 2-stroke rattle. Caleb didn't celebrate. He reached over the vibrating frame, grabbed the right cord, and pulled. The second engine caught instantly. The combined noise was catastrophic. The shed shook. The dirt floor vibrated under his boots. He gripped the heavy steel handles of the carriage and squeezed the bicycle brake lever. Both throttles slammed open. The massive, custom-linked ripping chain spun to life on the oversized bar, transforming into a terrifying blur of razor-sharp steel. The dual engines shrieked in perfect synchronized harmony, a wall of pure mechanical torque. The shed door creaked open. Arthur stood there, leaning heavily on his crutches. He was wearing his bathrobe, his eyes wide, staring through the blue smoke at his son. Caleb released the throttle. The machine settled into a heavy, rhythmic, dual-idling growl. He looked at his father. He didn't smile. He just wiped a smear of black grease from his forehead. "Tomorrow," Caleb shouted over the noise of the engines. "Tomorrow we cut." The cold was absolute. Frost coated the dying grass in the pasture, shattering like glass under Caleb's heavy rubber boots. It was 5 in the morning. The sky was the color of bruised iron. His father drove the rusted Ford tractor up the steep logging trail, the tire chains biting deep into the frozen mud. Caleb walked behind. He carried a heavy canvas duffel bag filled with wedges, a chalk line, steel brackets, and a sledgehammer. The custom twin-engine mill was strapped into the tractor's front loader bucket, looking like a piece of salvaged artillery. They reached the ridge just as the sun broke the horizon, spilling cold, pale light over the 40 acres. The white oaks stood like ancient pillars. They were massive, their bark deeply furrowed, holding decades of dense, heavy timber inside. Caleb didn't use the monster mill to fell the tree. He used a standard, rebuilt steel he had patched together 2 days prior. He picked a giant oak with a slight natural lean downhill. He cut his notch perfectly. He bored through the trunk, leaving a hinge of solid wood, then drove 2 plastic felling wedges into the back cut with the sledgehammer. The tree groaned. It was a deep, structural sound, vibrating through the soles of Caleb's boots. The canopy shivered. Then, the giant tipped. It fell with terrifying speed, crashing into the ridge with a force that shook the dust from the tractor's rusted fenders. The quiet that followed was heavy. His father killed the tractor engine. He limped over on his crutches, his breath rising in white plumes, and looked down at the massive trunk. It was nearly 36 inches across at the base. "She's a widowmaker," his father said quietly. "Harder than concrete in this cold." Caleb didn't answer. He just opened the canvas bag. This was the part where most amateurs failed. A chainsaw mill follows whatever surface it rides on. If the first cut is wavy, every board cut beneath it will be warped and useless. Caleb grabbed 2 heavy aluminum guide rails. He measured precisely, driving lag bolts directly into the end grain of the log to mount the brackets. He stretched a chalk line tight. He adjusted the rails until they were dead flat, securing them along the top of the oak. Then they unstrapped the beast. It took both of them to lift the 90-pound mill out of the tractor bucket and set it onto the aluminum rails. The steel carriage locked into place. The 40-inch bar spanned the entire width of the massive trunk. Caleb filled the oil reservoirs. He checked the chain tension. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold, but from the sheer weight of what was about to happen. If the gearing was wrong, if the welds failed under the torque, the chain could snap and whip back with enough force to cut a man in half. He gripped the left cord, pulled. The first engine roared. He gripped the right cord, pulled. The second joined it. The noise shattered the morning stillness. Birds scattered from the canopy a mile away. Caleb stepped behind the heavy push bar. He looked at his father. His father gave a single, tight nod. Caleb squeezed the linked throttle. Both engines screamed, hitting maximum RPM. The massive ripping chain blurred. Caleb leaned his weight into the push bar, driving the spinning steel into the end of the log. The oak fought back immediately. The sound changed from a high-pitched scream to a deep, guttural howl as the teeth bit into the dense end grain. Sawdust didn't spray. It exploded. Thick, wet ribbons of oak shot out from the discharge chute, burying Caleb's boots in seconds. He pushed. His boots slipped in the frost. He dug in harder. The machine vibrated violently, sending shockwaves up his forearms, into his shoulders, rattling his teeth. The heat radiating off the dual-engine blocks was intense, warming his face, while the winter wind froze his back. It was agonizingly slow. 1 inch, 2 inches. The chain chewed through knots that had formed during the Carter administration. The smell of hot bar oil mixed with the sharp, acidic tang of wet white oak, a smell like vanilla and cheap bourbon. 5 feet in, the left engine started to bog down. The pitch dropped. Caleb backed off the throttle just a fraction, letting the chain clear the sawdust from the kerf, then rolled back onto it. The engine caught its breath and screamed again. He had to read the wood through the vibration in his hands. Push too hard, you bind the bar and snap the chain. Push too slow, you burn the wood and glaze the cutters. It took 12 minutes to make the first 8-foot pass. 12 minutes of unbroken, deafening, bone-jarring violence. When the bar broke through the far end of the log, Caleb released the throttle. The engines dropped to their heavy, synchronized idle. He collapsed over the push bar, his chest heaving, his muscles burning with lactic acid. He was drenched in sweat despite the freezing temperature. His father maneuvered the tractor closer. He lowered the front loader, looping a heavy nylon strap under the massive slab they had just cut. The tractor whined, the hydraulics straining, and lifted the thick slab of bark and sapwood up and away. Below it lay the fresh cut. Caleb wiped his safety glasses on his sleeve and stepped forward. It was flawless. The surface was straight and true. The grain of the white oak swept in tight, beautiful ribbons of gold and pale brown. It was pristine, high-grade lumber. Hidden inside a tree the commercial loggers had offered pennies for. His father reached out, running a calloused, grease-stained thumb over the wet grain. He didn't say a word. He just looked at his son. Caleb didn't celebrate. He grabbed a heavy wrench and adjusted the carriage height down exactly 2¼ inches. "Keep the tractor running," Caleb said, his voice raw from breathing exhaust. "We got 20 more to cut." Over the next 6 weeks, Caleb rarely slept. He milled before the school bus arrived. He milled until the halogen work lamps burned out in the frozen dark. He wore earplugs beneath heavy, protective muffs, but his ears rang constantly. His knuckles were permanently swollen. He lost 10 pounds, his collarbones jutting sharply against his canvas jacket. The barn transformed. The rusted husks of old tractors were pushed outside into the snow. In their place, massive stacks of lumber began to rise. Caleb stacked the thick slabs meticulously, separating each heavy board with thin wooden stickers to allow the air to circulate. He painted the end grain of every slab with cheap latex paint to prevent the wood from cracking as it dried. Word leaked. In Oakhaven, the sound of 2 chainsaws running simultaneously for hours on end was impossible to hide. At first, the diner crowd assumed Caleb was just cutting a massive amount of firewood. But Hank the mechanic had driven past the ridge road and seen the tractor pulling the trailer loaded with heavy, squared-off timbers. The jokes stopped. A quiet, shifting curiosity took over. By late January, the foreclosure clock had 30 days left. The bank called twice a week. The heating oil tank was scraping the bottom. They were eating government cheese and venison pulled from a neighbor's freezer. On a Tuesday afternoon, a heavy, polished, black dually truck rolled up the cracked asphalt of their driveway. It wasn't a local truck. It had out-of-state plates and a clean, unmarked bed. A man stepped out. He wore clean Carhartts that had never seen a grease gun and expensive leather boots. His name was Callahan. He owned a high-end custom timber framing and furniture company out of Asheville, catering to the wealthy folks building luxury cabins in the mountains. Callahan didn't knock on the front door. He walked straight toward the barn. Caleb was inside, tightening the chain on the mill. His father was sitting on a bucket, resting his leg. "Heard a rumor down at the hardware store," Callahan said by way of greeting. His voice was smooth, businesslike. "Heard some kid was pulling 30-inch slabs out of the ridge with a homemade rig. Figured it was a tall tale." Caleb stood up. He wiped his hands on a rag. He didn't say anything. Callahan walked past him, approaching the massive stacks of oak and walnut. He pulled a heavy steel tape measure from his belt. He checked the width. He checked the thickness at the front of a slab, then walked to the back and checked it again. "Dead flat," Callahan muttered, sounding mildly irritated, as if he had expected to find garbage. He pulled a small digital moisture meter from his pocket, pressing the sharp pins into the wood. "Still green. Needs to dry in a kiln for a month. I sealed the ends," Caleb said quietly. "It won't check." Callahan looked at the painted ends. He looked at the perfect spacing of the drying stickers. Then he looked at the twin-engine monstrosity sitting by the barn door. He walked over to it, staring at the sloppy welds, the bicycle brake cable, the dual carburetors. "You build this?" Callahan asked. "I did." "What's powering the left side?" "A Husqvarna block with a steel coil and a custom gasket." Callahan let out a low whistle. "It's ugly as sin. A OSHA inspector would have a heart attack just looking at it." "It cuts flat," Caleb said. His voice was hard, defiant. Callahan turned his back to the machine and looked at the stacks. There were over 3,000 board feet of premium white oak and another 1,000 of black walnut. "Commercial guys offered you what?" $5,000 for the lot?" Callahan asked, looking at Caleb's father. The old man nodded slowly. "About that." Callahan pulled a small notebook from his chest pocket. He did some quick math with a silver pen. The silence in the barn was heavy, broken only by the wind rattling the tin roof. Caleb felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He gripped the dirty rag in his hands until his knuckles turned white. "I pay premium for wide slabs. Furniture guys go crazy for this grain," Callahan said, not looking up from his book. "I'll take the whole barn. I'll send a flatbed on Thursday. I'll write you a check right now for $22,000. And I want right of first refusal on whatever you cut next month." Caleb couldn't breathe. The air felt thin. 22,000. It was enough to stop the foreclosure. It was enough to pay the back taxes. It was enough to fill the oil tank for 2 winters. His father didn't smile. He just reached out a calloused hand. "We got a deal," his father said. Callahan shook his hand, wrote the check on the hood of his clean truck, and drove away. Caleb stood in the barn doorway, holding the piece of paper. It felt weightless. He stared at the numbers. He heard the crunch of gravel and looked up. Hank's rusted tow truck had pulled into the driveway. Behind it came Old Man Higgins in his beat-up sedan. The 2 men parked and walked slowly toward the barn. They stopped a few feet away, looking past Caleb into the dim interior. They saw the massive, perfectly stacked rows of gold and brown timber. Then they looked at the machine. Higgins stepped closer. He peered at the left engine block. Peeling through the grease and sawdust, the faded, cracked orange plastic of the dead saw he had given away 2 months ago was clearly visible. Higgins took off his dirty cap. He ran a hand through his thinning grey hair. "I'll be damned," Higgins whispered. Hank just stood there with his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. He looked at Caleb, the scrawny kid in the oversized jacket, the kid they had laughed out of the diner. "Boy," Hank said, his voice thick with a strange mixture of shame and awe. "If you ever need a heavy winch to pull those logs out of the gully, you just call the shop. I ain't charging you." They didn't apologize. In Oakhaven, men didn't have the vocabulary for that. But an offer of free labor was as close to begging forgiveness as a man like Hank would ever get. Caleb looked at the men. He looked at their worn faces, their tired eyes. He didn't feel angry anymore. He just felt exhausted and completely, deeply alive. "Thanks, Hank," Caleb said evenly. "I'll let you know." The men nodded, turned, and walked back to their trucks. Caleb walked back into the barn. His father was standing by the mill. The old man reached out and rested his hand on the cold, rusted steel of the push bar. He looked at his son, his eyes shining in the dim light. "Get some sleep, son," he said softly. "Tomorrow we sharpen the chain. Sometimes the people who laugh the loudest are just the ones most afraid to try. If this story of grit, raw engineering, and proving the doubters wrong hit home for you, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm to push these stories to more people who need to hear them. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new narrative, and share this video with someone who is quietly building their own empire. Keep building. See you next time.